By 2025, Intel had delivered chips to over 50 million cars. Then suddenly, they pulled the plug. In June, the company quietly shut down its entire automotive division. Hundreds of engineers were laid off, and its facility in Munich gone overnight. The headlines blamed weak profits. But that's just the surface. Intel's decision was triggered by something far more systemic: escalating trade wars, critical material shortages, and a supply chain Intel no longer controlled. Behind the scenes, a brutal shift was happening, one that could leave America's semiconductor dream hanging by a thread. Because this wasn't just Intel stepping back, it was a collapse, engineered not in their labs, but in the chaos of global politics. In July 2025, Intel filed a notice with California regulators. 107 employees at its Santa Clara headquarters were being laid off. Not just interns or assistants, these were high-level engineers, chip designers, and software architects. At the same time, in Munich, Germany, its automotive chip hub was being dissolved completely. The decision stunned analysts. After all, the automotive unit wasn't a small project. It had been a core part of Intel's strategy to diversify away from PCs and into smart vehicles. So why abandon it? The first signs had appeared months earlier when gallium and silicon carbide shipments from China were quietly delayed. These aren't just rare materials, they're critical for power electronics in electric vehicles. And China controls over 90% of global supply. Suddenly, Intel's roadmap no longer depended on performance. It depended on politics.
Intel's retreat wasn't just layoffs. They dismantled the entire automotive roadmap, ending chip development for vehicle sensors, autonomous driving modules, and infotainment systems. The chipmaker that once boasted it could power the brains of the modern car now had nothing to offer the automotive industry. R&D teams were disbanded, product lines terminated mid-cycle. The deeper problem wasn't demand, it was access. Intel relied on China for critical raw materials like gallium, germanium, and silicon carbide. But by mid-2025, China began tightening export controls, citing national security. This was a direct retaliation to U.S. tariffs and chip sanctions imposed earlier that year. One Reuters report warned that U.S. automakers could face shutdowns by July if rare earth supplies didn't resume. Intel, unable to secure reliable input materials, had no choice but to cancel forward contracts. Without guaranteed supply, clients walked away. Major European automakers started sourcing chips from domestic providers or rivals like Qualcomm and NVIDIA. Qualcomm offered a complete vehicle platform with AI, infotainment, and connectivity all under one roof. Intel didn't. They lacked a native software ecosystem for cars, no real-time OS, no machine learning backbone. It was hardware without a brain. Ironically, Intel's automotive division received almost no support from the $52 billion CHIPS Act. While subsidies flowed to fabs producing AI and military-grade processors, auto-focused initiatives were sidelined. A senior Intel manager anonymously stated, "We were too big for EV subsidies, too small for defense. We fell through the cracks." As a result, Intel had no fiscal buffer to weather raw material shocks or customer loss. They folded. At first glance, Intel's exit looked like a business decision, a failed bet, a refocus on AI. Nothing unusual. But that's not what really happened. The collapse of Intel's automotive division wasn't about market demand. It was about America losing control of its industrial foundation. For decades, the U.S. outsourced its chip supply chain to Asia, assuming that strategic materials and manufacturing capacity would always remain available. That illusion shattered in 2025. When the U.S. raised tariffs to 145% on Chinese tech imports, Beijing didn't just retaliate with words, they weaponized the one thing Washington couldn't replace: raw materials. Gallium, germanium, neodymium. China supplies over 90% of the global market for each. With a few bureaucratic strokes, shipments were delayed or denied outright. Factories halted, contracts were canceled, schedules collapsed, and Intel, without direct access to these inputs, was left defenseless. They weren't defeated by competition, they were outmaneuvered by geopolitics.
At Intel's Santa Clara campus, the emails hit on a Tuesday morning. Subject line: Automotive Division. Closure notice. 107 engineers, many with decades of experience, were told their projects were canceled. Their badges would be deactivated in 2 weeks. In Munich, Germany, a similar memo circulated. The entire European auto chip team was dissolved. One engineer, speaking anonymously to the press, described it as like watching a decade of work vanish in a single click. He had spent 8 years building firmware for electric vehicle controllers. Now, his entire codebase was archived, abandoned, never to ship. Another technician, laid off at 52, said he had to cancel his daughter's college tuition deposit, not because he didn't plan well, but because a superpower decided to tighten its grip on rare earths. Intel's collapse in automotive wasn't isolated. It was a signal that the US doesn't control the very foundations of modern industry: materials, factories, software ecosystems, that even giants with billions in cash reserves are vulnerable to a single customs delay in Shenzhen or an export notice from Beijing. This isn't about one company. It's about a country that thought it could lead the future without holding the keys to the present. And it's about an industry, semiconductors, that may soon find itself designing the next generation of technology, but with no way to build it. Have you ever watched a factory vanish? Not because it failed, but because the ground beneath it moved. Do you know someone in the auto or chip industry affected by sudden shifts in trade policy? Tell us what you're seeing, because this may be Intel today, but tomorrow it could be your company, your town, your future.